Okay, so we're going to start with what is culture, and one kind of acceptable definition that has been proved, or at least components of what we consider culture, are based on kind of these four ideas that it deals with our customs. So customs being, focus on what religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, when we eat, what we eat. It can include our clothing and our the way we dress. And then we have practices, and this goes to, what is our practice of, if we look at it from a religious prayer, ceremony, those types of things. When we look at it from school, what is our educational practices? What do we use? We kind of use this classroom setting that was uh, promoted by the Protestants, where you have a teacher and then several pupils, as they would say in elementary school, and they sit in the chairs. The teacher sits. That's kind of a practice that we have. Work is another example. So, here in the United States, we promote 40 hours a week, but part of our culture is you put in the time you need to in order to finish the job. So while we have this kind of rule of 40 hours, we often practice much more than that, and that's kind of a cultural thing. Routines is the way in which we go about our life, and we go about, sleeping, eating, all of those day-to-day things that tend to be repeated over and over and over. And as I mentioned on Monday, routines can be as much as when we eat. There's some cultures who eat throughout the day, and there's cultures like ours that have solid breakfast, lunch, dinner, maybe some snacks in between. Here in the United States, there's a big coffee culture, which is a routine thing for most Americans. Whereas if we look at somewhere like England or India as examples, it's more of a tea culture or tea routine. And they still have things known as tea times and those kinds of things. Scripts, as part of culture, is the way we view how things should happen. So we have a script for a birthday party and how that should look. We have a script for what we should expect when, for example, when we walk into a classroom. We have a script for different labor jobs. We have a script for. We even have scripts down to things like homelessness and success and high income people, and we have different ways that, based on our culture, we view those different ideas or those different processes or those different peoples. Okay. Probably one of the very first kind of quote unquote scientific or social science definitions for culture was done in 1871 by Sir Edward Taylor, and he defined culture as the complex whole, which includes knowledge, beliefs, art, laws, morals, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by, at this time, man as a member of a society. Okay. But if you look at this is a very broad, what do they say, broad paintbrush of anything. You could pretty much call anything a cultural thing based on this definition. And that's why we're trying to refine what it is that makes up culture. But something I didn't focus on very much while we in our conversations is very much culture. And we'll look closer at this, but I have kind of neglected it as one of the topics, is the issue of art. Art being sculptures, paintings, even graffiti, but it also includes music. Okay, so you've probably heard, you have the country music culture, the rap culture, the heavy metal culture, and each of them are considered kind of subcultures, but the music is part of a broader culture. It's kind of included within our definition of who we are. Okay. And so I've neglected that as I've been explaining culture as we move along, but it'll definitely be a topic we'll come to as we go along this journey in our more in-depth analysis of the influence of culture. Probably one way to think about culture is using what's called the toolkit metaphor. Okay. So the toolkit includes the skills, abilities, practice, scripts, and worldview that help us navigate and make sense of our social world. Now, I kind of prefer this definition because what it suggests is a two-way street between culture and the individual. We use these tools, so we learn how we should dress, how we should act in certain situations, kind of what is, so we mentioned worldview. We could bring up that difference between collectivism and individualism. That's kind of a worldview that we may have. Um, and we use all this cultural information, quote unquote, to navigate our world, to know that if we go from Tucson to um, Utah, we all know that we have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This is just kind of a simple example. And so it helps us guide our work. But when those scripts and those practices don't work, this is when we start to see cultural change. Okay. And we can mention this again. I'm not sure if I mentioned this in this class, but we could look at this kind of from a homosexuality perspective. Okay. And I'm using that term because that was the term that was used before 1999 specifically. Because before 1999, in what was called the DSM-3, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, um, homosexuality was considered a disease, a disorder that needed treated. And indeed, a lot of states and mental health professionals, you could be ordered by the courts to go through some type of treatment for that disorder during up to that time. But the cultural change wasn't due to, well, maybe it was due to some scientific findings or some things, but it really had to do with the cultural change. Because the decision to take homosexuality out of the DSM in the revised version of the DSM-4 was a vote among the American Psychiatric Association. They basically put out a ballot to all of their members and asked, should this be included or excluded as a mental disorder? And of course, as you probably guessed, the majority came back and said, no, it should not be a disorder. That's an example of when individual scripts don't meet the worldview and you see that cultural change and that cultural shift, at least within that domain of understanding um, human sexuality. Okay. So this is what's meant by a toolkit. It informs you, and most of the time, it guides us through our day-to-day activities and the way we make sense of the world and gets us along. Culture has been a very good tool for us because it's been a good survival mechanism. Okay. But we also have to understand that there is this influence from the individuals that can make cultural shifts. I think this is in our text. Um, uh, So some other ways that culture has been understood is a phenomenon of shared, learned, lived experience and performance. So it's that behaviors that we do collectively. It's that lived experience we do collectively. The context of learning and development and participating in daily culture and practices, social interactions, and envelopes individuals and groups of people. And this is something that I want to focus on, and I know I've said this already in this class, um, is development and learning. Okay. I think it was the first week or the first day of class, maybe the second, that I mentioned that human beings are kind of a unique species. We're not the only ones, but we're one of the very few species that are born with underdeveloped brains. Okay. Indeed, 90% of our brain develops between the age of 0 and 6 years of age. What this means for the human species, as I'll put it, is that instead of our brains being fully developed within the mother's womb, it develops in a social cultural environment, not a biological environment. And this is kind of this important idea of context of learning and development that we truly do physically develop and learn in a social cultural context, not in a biological context. Okay. And as this third point is a phenomenon that helps us make sense. Yeah, Klein, you have your hand up, sir.
Um, when within a culture, their Aboriginal language, like they're saying the native language of a tribe, or for instance, the Apache language is not spoken much. In order to revise that, a group might say we're going to start talking with from 0 up to 6-year-old talk nothing. Majority of our speech will be in the Apache language with them. They will learn that because of this um, cultural environment that they're growing up in.
Exactly, Klein. Yes, and to kind of emphasize that point and the importance of making sure children are exposed to their native language at that early development is around 24 months of age. If a child doesn't hear certain sounds in a different language or anything, they won't hear it. Our brain just says, our brain has kind of a shut off mechanism that says after this certain point of development, we won't hear any other sounds than the sounds we've been exposed to. Um, and so when we come to reclaiming native languages, it's very, very important to start with those early in those early childhood years because I'm sure that there's sounds in the Apache language that are unique to the Apache language. Okay. And to kind of emphasize some examples of this, my wife is a native Spanish speaker. And then she tries to teach me certain words and stuff, and I say them. And when I was a kid, I wasn't exposed to the Spanish language at all, and I can't say them correctly because I'm not hearing the sound that she's making. Okay, this is also why, for example, if you listen to someone in a foreign language that you've never been exposed to, you can't hear the breaks in the words. Okay. Because those breaks in the words are a linguistic thing. And if we're not exposed to that language, when we hear another language, it sounds like one continuous word for a complete sentence. So they can't hear the difference between the person said, the break, person break said. They hear it as the person said, okay, with no break. And so that is why, yes, and when we look at reclamation of language and reclaiming language, it's really important to start with those early years. So, and again, it does have to do with what we're talking about here, is our brain is physically growing during this period of time. So Lance, you have your hand up.
Okay, so speaking of development and like delay, not so much delays, but learning and having to do with communication and language. So my son actually has a delay in communication. He had problems with his ears. Um, and that's something that we're working on. He had tubes and hearing tests and stuff like that. But I didn't know if me coming from a different culture and his dad being Hispanic, if that played a part in having maybe a delay in communication because his dad speaks Spanish primarily to him so that he can learn, and I speak English and some Chickasaw to him. So, can that cause a delay, or is there any like, I don't know, I guess a learning slash total development delay between cultures and children?
So to actually answer that question, I'm thinking of multilingual families and stuff like this. Is you all speaking those three different languages probably helped his delay. It didn't worsen it. Because research we've seen on children who are raised in multilingual households, they tend to be better off with language. They tend to be better off with um, uh, um, uh, complex tasks, complex sentences. So what I would actually say, just based on the research, so this is just based on the research, exposing your kiddo to those three different language probably benefited him more than it delayed him more, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
And Klein, did I answer your question?
Yes, you did, Dr. Peterson. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question. Okay.
Unless you're in my situation, when I was younger, I was bilingual in Spanish and English. But here in Missouri, I was kindergarten, first grade, second grade. I was really quiet because I really didn't understand the English that much because Spanish was spoken at home mostly. And therefore, they dubbed me as, they classed me as um, slow learning. And so I was out in the hallway most of my time in like kindergarten, first grade, and second grade.
Yeah, and I think that is that is a good example of what we would call cultural bias, right? Remember those scripts we have? And so we have individuals who, especially going into probably a Missouri state, I know this happened in Idaho all the time, Montana, those majority English speaking states. They use that script of if they're not speaking quote unquote the English language fluently, they must be delayed in some way, despite having that multilingual ability and whatnot. And so that right there is a perfect example of what we would call a cultural script. Okay. Script being that if by a certain age you don't have a certain in our country, unfortunately, a certain English fluency, despite being fluent in some other language, they're in a lot of places they'll classify you as delayed. So that's a very perfect example of scripts and how they work in determining our cultural health. And I would be willing to bet if they administered the appropriate intelligence tests and everything, you would have spent less time in the hallway because look at where you are now, and look at what you're doing now, right? And so that is definitely an unfortunate thing, and hopefully we're starting to change those scripts about language and fluency within a given culture. But um, does that kind of um, provide some feedback on your situation?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. So let's look at, okay. So what is culture? One, it's a shared system of meaning. And I want to focus on this. It may be a shared system, but it does not necessarily mean it's an accepted system. All right. Because we know that there's a lot of subcultures here in the United States that are what called countercultures. So that's an extreme example of this. We may all have different views of, for example, the main script of marriage in the United States, man, woman, 2.5 children. And we may all have different scripts, but we all share that meaning. Okay. Um, Learn and pass one from one generation to the next. And this is probably the important thing and something that I feel like needs to be emphasized, okay, is cultures for them to be successful have to be adaptive and ever changing, okay? Culture is not a stagnant event. All right, and a good example of this is countries who went through from the predominant hunter-gatherer to the farm system to then come up to the Industrial Revolution and then up to the technology age. Through each of those stages of what we consider human evolution, this what you would call successful cultures, and I want to put a note on that. Successful cultures are the ones that continually adapted and changed to those different systems of navigating or adapting to the world. Now, I want to be careful with the term successful and unsuccessful cultures, okay? Because there are cultures who have difficulty moving, not because of the culture doesn't want to change or adapt, but because there's a broader culture that is stagnating that culture. The again, we'll go back to here in the United States, the whole idea of colonialization, those kinds of things. You can't say that, the loss of native land, native communities, native tribes was a failure of those cultures. Okay. That was more of a reclamation of those cultures. So I want to be careful when we say successful cultures versus unsuccessful cultures, because not all cultures that don't exist anymore don't exist because they weren't adapting to the situation, but it was something from, we look at, when the Spaniards came over, they bring over a new diseases, and the majority of the communities in those regions were not necessarily destroyed by the steel or blade. They were eliminated because of a new disease or a strand of disease. Okay. So I just want to be careful using those terms successful and unsuccessful and making sure we um, make the right differentiation. Okay. The other thing is symbolic representation. Now, people might think, symbolic, right? Like which is this is a wrong analogy, like the eagle, a flag, freedom, those kinds of things. Symbolic gets right down to the level of a red light means stop, a yellow light means speed up, and a green light means go. Okay, I'm kidding about the yellow light. Please, everyone, slow down. Um, but though just down to those basic symbols of a traffic light, um, are a representation of that culture. It's something that is transmitted and doesn't necessarily be taught. We listen to our parents, we watch other people when they're driving, and that is culturally transformed to us. So when we look at when you look at it from a symbolic perspective, I just want you to keep in mind that this doesn't necessarily mean complex symbols. Okay. And when we get into it, we'll see how strong of an influence those basic symbols have. And just to kind of put it basically, I would be willing to bet that the majority of us, if we were driving home at 2 a.m. in a very rural place where there was no traffic around and we had a red stoplight, I'm willing to bet that the majority of us would still stop at that red stoplight and wait for it to turn green. Because from a cultural perspective, we're thinking that even though there's not someone there actually actively looking at us, we feel as if we are being watched. And so we obey that symbol as if there was a lot of traffic. Okay. And so this is the subtlety of the power of symbols. And we'll get into talking about this when we get into morality. So there's several studies that show that individuals, if they don't have reminders of acting good, of being a moral person, that they have the tendency to cheat more often, they have the tendency to steal more often. And so even down to the subtleties of moral symbols. And that's why even a lot of anthropologists argue that, with the Catholic religion, we have the cross. With the Muslim religion, they have certain artifacts they keep with them, because what that's doing is reminding them of what they should be doing morally based on their cultural basis. And again, if we look at it at organization, this is why you have mission and vision statements. This is why you have standards that you set at the work. At TOCC, we have the Tashan Shan that we try to put everybody, everywhere, not everybody, but everywhere on walls at the campus, so that there's this constant reminder of the expected behaviors, the expected way to act. And so we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the nuances of symbols and how even unconsciously they can drive our behaviors. And we also see that culture is both our lived and performed past, and then this kind of gets to what we do on a daily basis, to what we watch, and what we view as our culture. Now, what is not culture? Okay. Your nationality is not culture. So being an American citizen is not the American culture. Okay. A nationality is your place of birth. That's where you were born at. And while we may make some identifying features about our place of birth, it's not necessarily our culture. And probably an example of this is, a person could be born in Idaho and move to um, New Jersey. So there's two places, their place of birth, Idaho, but their culture will follow them. Okay. Or even a cross-national example, if you go from here to South America, your cultural views will follow you, not your nationality, if that makes sense. You can think of situations in which individuals might activate a different culture and national identity, and this is kind of the point. Okay, is you can carry your culture with you, but not necessarily your national identity. Okay. Ethnicity is also not culture, even though there can be great overlap. Um, um, but ethnicity includes our language, customs, practices, and ancestry. Okay. It is the people we come from. Okay. And it's a free-flowing social construct. And this is what differs from when we talk about culture and ethnicity is that, so for example, my ethnicity in the past is Irish, German, um, and whatnot. What other countries my family mess around in? Um, but I didn't necessarily care. That culture didn't follow me. That ethnicity hasn't followed me. My ethnicity is very much different than the culture that I live in and I behave in. Even though I do like a good sausage and sauerkraut, um, 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 a lot of the ethnic uh, practices within Ireland and Germany, and I think England, and man, my family was busy. I don't carry those customs with me here in this culture that I'm living in. That's kind of an example of the difference between ethnicity and culture. Now, there can be a lot of overlap on these when a culture has a predominant ethnic group. Okay. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, is when you're in an area where the nation, the ethnicity, and the nation and the ethnicity tend to be mono-ethnic, meaning one ethnicity, then that's where the confusion between culture and ethnicity can happen. But I just want you to keep those kind of concepts in mind, that your language and customs and practices and your ancestry may not be the culture you're living in. You might prize it. I celebrate Oktoberfest sometimes. I enjoy sauerkraut and sausage. I get ornery when I drink like the Irish do. But beyond those things, there's no connection. Okay, so I just kind of want to focus, just kind of bring that about, that ethnicity is not necessarily culture unless it's within a mono-ethnic group. Okay. We've already went over this, and we've already gone over this. Done that. We've done that. I think this last part is just providing more emphasis on what we've talked about to this point. So I'm actually going to stop at this point, because these are just